This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell & Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
In the matter of Amador versus State, which dealt with bipartisan review of ballots and absentee ballots.
And is that Richard Amador or George Amador? Which I couldn't quite pick it up there.
Yeah, you are a student of the game. That is Rich Amador was my plaintiff.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a podcast about power and politics in New York State government. And because it's the season of petition signature challenges, that wonderful time of year when campaigns look to undercut their opponents by getting them disqualified from the ballot, we wanted to talk with an election attorney about this process. And to do that, we're joined in the studio by Adam Fusco, an Assembly Republican attorney by day, but one of the go-to GOP election lawyers by morning, nights, weekends, and probably all the other free time he has when the election calendar calls for it. And while we're going to focus this conversation almost exclusively on the legal maneuvering stemming from the petitioning process, check out Capitol Pressroom, where we talked with Adam about his other day job, working as the attorney for GOP gubernatorial candidate Bruce Blakeman, and his effort to overturn the decision by the Public Campaign Finance Board to deny him matching funds. While we've got a sophisticated audience here on Dispatches, I think we could probably do with a little bit of an explainer about the differences between, first off, general objections and specific objections and the timeline of going from one to another. So can you walk us through that?
So as an elections attorney, it's very seasonal, right? I'm relevant for about 3 months out of the year, and this is the time. So there's two steps to sort of seeking to either remove your opponent from the ballot or potentially remove someone else as a qualified objector. So what someone has to do is first file what's called a general objection. And mind you, all of this is dealt with at the administrative level with the State Board of Elections. Mm-hmm. The general objection is really a very simple form. It just says, my name is X, Y, and Z. I live in the district, and I'm going to make objections to this petition for grounds that will be stated later.
Okay.
So it's a placeholder. Within 6 days of that comes what are called specific objections. This looks a lot more like a formal court pleading. It's got exactly an explanation as to why this person may not have valid signatures and what the reasons are that the board should remove them from the ballot. So that could be everything from, hey, the person who signed this isn't in the district, or the person who signed this actually isn't enrolled in that party, or the signature doesn't look anything like the person whose signature is on file with the Board of Elections. It is a little arcane, and it is hyper-technical. But that being said, what we like to tell clients is the best campaign to have is one where you don't have an opponent. And so a lot of elections are won this time of year.
Well, when do you get involved in the process of potentially challenging petitions?
So I usually am notified right away. We see someone file a petition at the Board of Elections, and immediately you've got your team on it looking at these signatures.
Team?
Political operatives, research people, attorneys, people who are on the campaign staff, volunteers who may be on a county committee who helped out that candidate.
Because you definitely don't have to be an attorney to be familiar with this process. I mean, if you've collected signatures, you know what you're supposed to do, and so you probably also know what doesn't fly, and you could look at this and interpret it the way an election attorney might.
Some of the best reviewers of petitions and the best preparers of objections are not attorneys. Congressman Mike Lawler, one of the sharpest people I've ever seen when it comes to a discerning eye of whether a petition is valid or not.
Sure, he used to be a GOP operative. I think that's what he's still in my phone as, like Republican political operative.
I remember representing the congressman once a few years ago, when he was still with the state assembly. And it was just this time of year when, again, I was in my busy season.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Mike calling me on Easter probably 6 or 7 times. We're working 24 hours a day this time of year. But no, you certainly don't need to be an attorney to deal with the board element. And some of the most discerning eyes aren't, right? They're experienced people who may be on their local county committee or have worked in politics or just really have an understanding of how the process works. And so those are the folks who are really involved in the general and then the specific objection period. And that is what then triggers a hearing at the Board of Elections as to whether that petition remains valid or it should be invalidated.
Well, what is that period like? Because we're just talking about a few days, and for some of these races, we're talking about a lot of signatures to go through, especially as campaigns get used to the idea of being like, I need to file 2, 3, 4 times what the threshold is, so you're going to have to invalidate 2, 3, 4 times what that threshold would have been. So what's that operation like? Is everyone gathered somewhere and just, chain smoking cigarettes as they scroll through the PDFs? Are they all doing it from their homes and just connecting via Zoom? What can this look like?
I think before COVID, you probably saw people gathering more together to review these in person. When I first started doing this back 14 years ago, you didn't get access to documents right away like you do now. Right at the end of the day, the Board of Elections sends an email with every document that anyone filed. We used to actually have to have people go down to the Board of Elections and sit there and put in a little FOIL request and then scan in copies of everything they thought they might want to look at. That has changed a lot. So now, yeah, sure, people will get together. There's GOP headquarters, there's Democratic headquarters where people are doing this kind of work, but a lot of this happens remotely. A lot of this happens in people's offices or the privacy of their campaign headquarters or their home. But there is a collegial element to it. There's no doubt about it, because you're all sort of looking at this and trying to figure out, like you said, if there's 4 times the number of signatures, yeah, you're probably not getting that person invalidated. Unless there's like a big overarching, mistake, like a mistake on the caption of how they describe the title of office. Or maybe it didn't get there in time, or something, a cover sheet, which famously happened in an assembly race 6 years ago, where a sitting member of assembly was thrown off the ballot for lack of a cover sheet.
Who was this?
The member from New York City, Rebecca Seawright.
The 76th Assembly District?
You have a great memory.
Yeah.
She did, in fact, though, win the election nonetheless.
As an independent candidate, right?
Yeah.
In terms of that first glance and, I guess, deciding, is this worth our time, are there certain mistakes that you're like, hey, when I see that, I know this is worth our time and energy, versus one that might be more debatable and sure, we can get this to court, but a judge is not going to rule in our favor?
Exactly. So you really start with where can you grab the most signatures en masse, and that's going to be the statement of witness. At the bottom of each sheet of a designating petition, below the signatures of the actual voters, you have a person who's called a witness. They are purporting to have seen each one of those people sign in front of them, and they are then attesting to that under the penalty of perjury. If that witness makes a mistake, if they make an alteration, but it's not initialed, if we think that that witness didn't in fact witness that, if that witness isn't an enrolled member of that party, things like that, that invalidates the entire sheet. So your eyes really start with the bottom of the sheet, which is the witness statement, because that's going to get rid of all the signatures on that page if in fact one is correct about their theory of how the witness screwed up. Now, these are the really technical things, the dates, the signature, the address, the wrong town. That's what's going to be heard at the Board of Elections. There is a parallel track for designating petitions, and these are validator and invalidator proceedings in state Supreme Court. Just because someone's filing general and specific objections doesn't mean that at the same time they're not also preparing to go to court. It's called an anticipatory validator or an anticipatory invalidator. Board of Elections is ministerial in what it can rule on. It can really look at the 4 corners of the petition, the signature, the date, a lot of the things that I've talked about. But if you're really looking to put forward a theory of law, like, hey, I don't think this witness saw this person sign, or hey, this signature doesn't match what's on file with the Board of Elections, I think there was fraud, I think a husband signed for a wife or a neighbor signed for a neighbor. Those types of things are challenges that are going to go to state Supreme Court.
Well, short of a case where you go, hey, clearly this person didn't submit the requisite number of signatures. Sure, there's enough pages, but there's only one signature per page or whatever. Are there instances where the State Board of Elections is the final word on these challenges, or do they always end up in court because one side or the other is not going to be happy with how the Board of Elections rules and will want to exercise all of their possible levers?
Almost every one of these challenges gets dealt with at the board. Very few make it to court.
Okay.
It's the ones that you hear about because they're the most exciting or the closest that make it to court. Probably 80 or 90% of these are dealt with at the administrative level.
Is that because there isn't an option then to go to court, or because people are like, well, we tried, it would be a waste of time to go to court?
Usually the latter,
okay.
Right? Usually it's a question of resources. It's a question of whether they think they can actually get what they're looking for by going to a judge.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also opportunities once the board makes a ruling to still go to court. So under the election law, if someone files a petition and the board determines it to be invalid, that person then has 3 days to go to court and seek what's called a validator. As elections attorneys, we are under a very short time frame to do this. Petitions this year were filed up until April 6th. That means anyone who wanted to go to court, anyone who wants to go to court, would have to file a lawsuit, have a judge assigned, and serve everyone within 14 days. So that's April 20th.
Okay. We're in that window.
We are in the window. This is the hot time. So you've got these very short time frames upon which to operate. Between people not necessarily maybe having the resources to seek that second level of analysis, or quite literally just running out of time, really at the Board of Elections is where you see a lot of this work done. And also, too, I should note, there are petitions that are knocked out at the board without anyone ever objecting. The board has the ability to look at a petition, kind of like your example, if it requires 500 signatures and there's only a few pages, they can conduct what's called a prima facie analysis, and they would remove that person from the ballot right then and there. As a matter of fact, we're recording here at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The commissioners at the Board of Elections are meeting right now to make their prima facie determinations.
Fraud and lawsuit abuse are driving up car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Governor Hochul is proposing liability reforms to stop lawyers from gaming the system and help lower insurance prices. Florida made similar changes. Insurance costs are going down for most drivers, some up to 20%. But in Albany, Speaker Carl Heastie and Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins are still blocking reform. Why are they siding with the trial lawyer lobby against everyday New Yorkers? Visit keepnewyorkaffordable.org to learn more.
How aggressive are those prima facie determinations? For example, if I write in, I don't know, Seymour Butts on every single page, will they be like, I don't think that is a voter, and I don't think there are 500 Seymour Butts in the 111th Assembly District?
It's probably not going to be that, because that would require looking up if that in fact exists, which really goes beyond.
It could be a family name. You never know what's in Rotterdam.
You never know.
Sure.
Really, it's the egregious, obvious
The Duanesburg Butts family.
They live on the lake.
Yeah.
They take up all of Duane Lake. It's the obvious ones.
Mm-hmm.
Just today, I was working on one of those where the person just wrote for the district 122. Doesn't describe what assembly district, where it is, state of New York, member of assembly. Mm-hmm. Just a very obvious fatal defect of the way to describe
And you say
the
fatal.
title.
You don't think a judge would be like, hey, we get it. They're in New York when they collected these. People aren't going to think this is for Pennsylvania unless, they don't pass the basic IQ test, and then we probably should take away the right to vote, too. But, the judges won't potentially find some leeway there?
They're in election law, unlike, torts or personal injury, the judges are really confined. They are really only allowed to rule based upon the precedent and the statute. And there's a lot of case law that dictates that if it's not prescribed by the election law, you really can't go outside of it and create a remedy. So if this example of just a really poor description of office, like just writing 122, I don't think you're going to see a judge disturb that. Now, over the time that I've been doing this, courts have sort of been more liberal towards allowing people to remain on the ballot. I think there's a number of, very wise judges, but judges who think that let them figure it out, leave it to the voters, let them have an election, and that'll sort it out. That is certainly a theme that I think we've been seeing amongst the judiciary, that there's been a lot more sort of let them be on the ballot, let the voters decide. But when there's these very obvious fatal defects, I don't think you're going to see too many judges that are going to go outside the confines of the statute. Because remember, there's 2 more levels of review.
You don't
there's
want to get overturned.
Yeah, I mean, no judge wants to be overturned. And so if they make a really egregious ruling at the trial term, that's why the appellate division exists.
Are there any not wise judges that you'd like to identify on the air?
Absolutely. Can't wait.
Okay.
No thanks, Dave.
There are paid canvassers. There are volunteer canvassers. Who's better at collecting signatures and not having a mistake?
So I think the people that do it for the love of the game are the best ones you can find.
Even though the idea is maybe you get what you paid for if they're free and they're just doing this because they're true believers in the party or the candidates?
I think so. I think what you see in New York, you are allowed to pay people to get petitions. You can't pay them per signature because obviously that would sort of lead to fraud, right? Someone's going to want
more enthusiastic petitioning.
That's a fair argument. But you can pay someone a flat fee or an hourly fee to collect signatures. A lot of times, though, the people that take that kind of work up aren't experienced in this field.
Sure.
They may be driving Uber in the morning.
It's temporary work.
Yeah, and then passing petitions in the afternoon. It's not to say that they can't learn how to do this and do it properly. It's not that hard if I can figure it out. But I think the people who tend to do this year in, year out on a volunteer basis are the ones who tend to get the most valid signatures. And you do see some really crazy theories out there about how to get signatures in mass. A lot of people camp out in front of grocery stores, places like that, so that they can, get to 1,000 voters in a couple days. But most of the people who come to that grocery store may not be enrolled in the party. They may not even live in the district.
Well, yeah, that's the New York City model of you go to a train station that's in your district and you just start collecting, which to me sounds like a major headache because then you have almost no idea unless you're post-screening all of those people to say, yep, this one's good, this one's good. I mean, do you focus on doing cases outside of the Big Apple, or do you do some in the New York City area as well?
Oh, I absolutely do cases from Suffolk to Erie County.
Okay.
Matter of fact, just this morning I was in Orange County for a hearing involving the town of Newburgh.
Okay.
So, there aren't too many of us that live in this little niche bar, and so I do, take cases all across the state.
Well, yeah, there are not a lot of attorneys who do election law, probably because, like, as you said, it's 3 months of the year of work, and you basically have to be, I'll say on retainer with, a legislative body, essentially, to pay your bills the rest of the year. I mean, how many people are there, and do you all know each other? We all know each other. I think people would sort of consider me more of a Republican elections attorney, although I certainly will do work for the other party if it makes sense, if it's not a conflict with any of my clients. But yeah, there really aren't. Only in a primary, or when would it not be a conflict? Well, there aren't many Republicans running in Manhattan. Touche. So, it may work out for me to represent, quote unquote, the other side. And I have to imagine, there's so few election attorneys that they might turn to you in that case. Absolutely. There are so few of us. And yes, we largely get along, even if we tend to represent one side of the party or the other. As a matter of fact, one attorney who is a real veteran election attorney tends to represent, Democratic enrolled members and candidates. We're famous friends. We get along very well. Do you want to name names here? We'll leave that for another day. But before I really got to know this individual, it was funny. We were trying a case together, and this was again during COVID. I live up in the middle of nowhere on Sacandaga Lake in northern Fulton County, and unbeknownst to me, he had moved up into the Adirondacks as well. So while I thought I was going against someone from New York City, we were probably 10 minutes apart. Any big difference between objecting to signatures in, say, a congressional race versus dealing in a state legislative race? One of the big differences is just the amount of paper, right? You'll see 8,000-10,000 signatures come in a congressional race. And obviously it spans a little bit bigger geographical body than your county race or your assembly or senate race. So there's a little more analysis of, is this person actually in the district? Are they enrolled? For instance,
Looking at like Congressional District 21, that takes up a portion of the state spanning across some, I think, 11 counties.
All the way down to your home of Fulton County.
Exactly. And, it's bigger than the state of Rhode Island and Delaware combined.
And probably more guns, too.
I would think so. I live in the Adirondacks. It's certainly a two-way country.
Sure.
It's an open secret in Albany that the trial lawyers have massive influence over the legislature. It's time for legislators to choose hardworking New Yorkers over wealthy billboard lawyers. If you think your legislators are not being influenced by the trial lawyers, think again. Visit keepnewyorkaffordable.org to learn more.
In your downtime, obviously you work for some of the Republicans as well, but do you do anything to like bone up on election law? Are you trying to keep tabs on what the legislature is doing? What does your downtime look like, and how much of it is election law related?
So you spend a lot of time studying, the changes to the law. Mm-hmm. The legislature is constantly, and not in a bad way, but is constantly tinkering with or amending the election law. So it's very incumbent upon us to keep up to those changes. As an attorney, we have to undergo what's called continuing legal education.
Yeah.
I try to take my classes in the field of election law.
You don't choose it based on where the CLE opportunity is? Like my dad is going up to Montreal in like a month.
Must be nice. If they start putting them in like Naples, Florida, maybe I would take a look at that. But, I try to study up, right? Uh-huh. You try to stay relevant. And then you talk to your friends. Hey, what did you experience in this case? Hey, what can you teach me about this, that, and the other? And then the other thing, which is, just to really show you how sort of hyper-technical this area is, you really have to study the postal system. A lot of what we do involves serving people via the mail. So you go back to the specific objections. How do you get specific objections filed? Well, within 6 days of filing your generals, you go to the board and you file them. But you have to also serve the opposing candidate. You're not going to be serving them in person. It's very rare. So you're going to be serving them via the mail. Well, unfortunately, right now, the United States Postal Service doesn't really guarantee any sort of delivery.
Sure.
Certainly don't guarantee overnight mail. So you end up going to FedEx and using their services. So you really study who is guaranteeing getting mail to someone, because if you don't put in that affidavit of service showing that that person was served within those 6 days, you're out, and there's no getting around it. And the same really goes with the service of papers in these validators and invalidators in state Supreme Court. A lot of this has to do with the U.S. Postal Service or with FedEx and proving whether or not someone was served. A lot of what I do you could probably learn by watching Seinfeld. I made a joke just last year in court where someone was objecting to one of my client's petitions based upon someone failing to include their zip code. And I just looked at the judge and I said, Your Honor, let me let you in on a little secret about zip codes. They're meaningless. Newman told you all you need to know.
I'll tell you a little secret about zip codes. They're meaningless.
I believe you also said, the mail never stops.
That's it. And so don't these cases. So you really do, sort of learn from the other attorneys and from studying it. But also, in the downtime, like watching funny comedies that remind you about what you do. As a matter of fact, I tried a case in Utica. And I did a news interview right now, and I was prepared to go on and watch myself on the news that evening at 6. But I was cut because a beaver escaped from the Utica Zoo. So I turned to my girlfriend. I said, well, this is just like Michael Scott when he wanted to get on the news, but the otter was birthed at the zoo, and they bumped his story.
Well, I want to come back to the idea of where these cases are heard. And it's one thing to have a case against the Public Campaign Finance Board and hear that in Albany County. I guess that makes sense. But these cases around upstate New York, having to bring them to one specific area, do you think that ultimately is beneficial because maybe you'll get some judges who now have more familiarity with election law? Or do you think the old way of doing things, where the cases were closer to home, made more sense or produced different rulings?
I don't think that because a judge is in one area that judge has some expertise. Mm-hmm. I think there's judges in each of the counties in this state who are more than qualified to hear these cases. Now, obviously, there was a redistricting snafu. Someone brought a case to challenge redistricting. They brought it in Steuben County.
Sure, of course.
And, that's the logical place to go, Bath, New York. Now, ultimately, and those are good friends of mine, they did great work. They won the case. The legislature didn't like that, right? They thought that was kind of forum shopping. So
I think they didn't like the outcome. I think in retrospect, they wouldn't have really cared either way if it had gone their way.
Right, it's a really results-based business.
Exactly.
So I think it's certainly fair to give people a shake to have these cases heard close to home. I don't think someone should have to drive from, Watertown to Syracuse just to have a case heard. I don't think someone should have to go from Suffolk County, from the Hamptons to White Plains just to have a case heard, which is unfortunately what the legislature did when they limited venue to just 4 places when it comes to challenging things like redistricting or challenging the constitutionality of Article 16 of the election law.
So when it comes to journalists covering anything that incorporates election law, the thing that always drives me insane is post an election when they describe absentee vote counting as a recount, even though this is just the process of counting paper and it just kind of feels like a recount. Is there anything that journalists do in their coverage of election law, whether it's the petitions and objections to them or even the process of getting on the ballot, that drives you insane? Are there common mistakes or just things that stick in your craw?
That's a really good question. I think generally what you guys do, you're really on top of it.
Oh, shucks.
I think you tend to sort of understand what it is that we do. I would say, one of the things you point out is the sort of calling it a recount when it's not. In New York State, almost everything gets decided on paper ballots, and a lot of cases go to a manual recount nonetheless. I would say generally just some of the questions I get from journalists is, how quickly is this going to play out? And the answer is very quickly. They're all going to play out very quickly. Do you think you're going to win? Yeah, I always think I'm going to win.
Yeah, I mean, we got to get paid. If your client hears you say, no, we're not going to win, I think the checks probably stop coming.
I would think so. Now, you got to kind of, I think, live in sort of a political hub to do what I do. I grew up in Auburn, New York, in Cayuga County. Great place. Still go back a lot. My mom still lives there. But I think if I hung a shingle out as an elections attorney in a place where there's not sort of this, political geocenter, I may not be in business for very long.
What do you root for on Election Day? Do you just hope for close elections on Election Day, or some sort of issue with the weather so that there's going to be something that can be contested? I don't know. What are you looking for on Election Day?
You root for everyone to get a chance to vote.
Sure.
I don't like seeing people stand in line in New York City either. I think that's unfair. I think Larry David should be able to hand them water. But,
what about a hot dog? I think that's under like a Zellner-Myrie bill.
Is it?
Yeah,
I haven't seen that.
It's ensuring that people can get like food and other things too, and not be considered like a bribe to vote.
If they're online for hours, I think that is only fair. We don't want people passing out. Really, you just want to see everyone get a chance to exercise their elective franchise.
So altruistic of you.
People should be allowed to vote, and then I'll challenge it later.
Sure. Well, we've been speaking with Adam Fusco. He's an Assembly Republican attorney by day, but one of the go-to GOP election lawyers in all other waking hours. Adam, thank you so much for making the time.
Dave, thanks for having me, and look forward to coming back sometime. That's also probably when people look at their Ring doorbell camera and pretend they're not home.
Sure.
But anyways.
Or see who's throwing away their mailers.
Exactly. No, that's a story for another day.